So the title of tonight's talk is The Greatest Game Ever Played. It's a melodramatic title, and the subtitle gets even more melodramatic. Jim Thorpe, Dwight Eisenhower, and the Battle of the Soul of America. Might be overselling it just a bit, but you know, when we come up with the title, we try and get focuses and seats, and look, it worked. So let me set the stage here. It was an autumn afternoon, November 9th, 1912, on the Plain, which is the main parade grounds at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. By the way, I see it's a couple of my students have just joined us. Remind me to get your names, guys, after class, so you can get the bonus. That's another strategy for encouraging attendance at these events. Offer bonus credit to your students. November 9th, 1912, on the Plain, which is the main parade grounds, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, a crowd of approximately 5,000. It was a big crowd for college football back in those days, had gathered to see the cadet football team, which was a traditional power on the landscape of college football, take on a much heralded newcomer to the upper echelons of the sport, the football team from Carlisle Indian Industrial School, located at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Part of what makes this game special is the cast of characters involved, including some of the most influential figures, not only in the history of college football, but also 20th century American history in general. Carlisle was coached by none other than Glenn Pop Warner, one of the most influential and innovative minds in the history of football, not just college football, but football in general, who at this point was near the beginning of what would ultimately be a storied coaching career. You know anything about Pop Warner, you probably know that he's the inspiration for the Pop Warner football leagues, the youth football league, through which millions of prospective players have passed over the last several decades. He's also one of the most influential innovators in the history of college football. If you ever watched a football game and seen the linemen lined up like that, and what's that right there? T formation. No, I'm pointing to the dot. 3-point stance. He invented that. He also invented the body block, tackling sleds, and also that formation up there. Does anybody know what that is? Single wing. It's not actually a single wing. It's you're close though. Double wing. Double wing. It's the double wing formation, which is a power running formation, which actually involves placing two wing. We call them running backs today, but in this setup they'd be called wing backs on either side of a heavy offensive line with two tackles and two tight ends. One of the advantages of this formation is that it allows for both power running and misdirection. It's an ideal setup for lateral plays because the quarterback can pitch to the wing back running one direction. You can pitch to the wing back running the other direction. So you can do all kinds of fancy trick plays. By the way, this game is where the double wing formation gets unveiled for the first time. And if you know anything about football, like tactics and strategy, the double wing formation is the antecedent to today's spread offenses and also shotgun offenses. So it kind of begins a lot of interesting changes in the way football is played. Anyways, I digress. So Pop Warner is the coach. Pop Warner he's at the beginning of his career. This is his best team ever.
So was West Point coach?
No, he's the Carlisle coach.
Oh,
he teaches Carlisle. This is his best team ever, and it's a team that's widely expected to compete for a national championship, which was Warner's ultimate goal, to win a national championship. Carlisle, and then you have the team itself. The team included their quarterback, Gus Welch, a shifty and agile Chippewa signal caller from with Scott, but it should be obvious by this point, Carlisle Indian Industrial School is one of those Indian boarding schools. It was quite common in the United States at that time. It was actually the subject of another talk just yesterday here at CCC. We had another guest speaker coming in and talking about a recent Department of the Interior investigative report into the legacy of Indian boarding schools around the country. But anyways, Gus Welch was the quarterback. He was an All-American and a future college football Hall of Famer. Would later serve in World War I as a second lieutenant in the infantry before beginning a storied coaching career in college football himself. There was also Joseph Napoleon Big Chief Guion, a left tackle, a bruising offensive lineman and punishing blocker. Guion was another Chippewa from Minnesota, probably the best lineman, certainly the biggest player at like 6'2", 6'3" in size and 250 pounds, which was huge for back then. Who would go on to play professional football in the new National Football League, founded in the 1920s, and would be elected to both the college football and pro football halls of fame. And last but not least, there was the incomparable Jim Thorpe, dazzling tailback from the Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma. Thorpe was easily the most famous graduate the Carlisle Indian Academy ever produced. He was equally talented in football and track and field. And by the fall of 1912, when these two teams squared off with one another, he was, and this is not an exaggeration, but a simple statement of fact, the most famous athlete in the world. Because a couple of months before this game happened, he had been in Europe, where he'd been competing in the Olympic Games. And who here knows the Stockholm Olympics in Sweden? Who here knows what what events he won at the Stockholm Olympics? Anybody know?
Decathlon and pentathlon.
The decathlon and the pentathlon, which are combined events. One of the decathlon has 10 events. The pentathlon, actually the pentathlon is no longer run, but it had 5 events. So he competed in a total of 15 track and field events. And he won them both, going away. And he was widely pronounced the greatest athlete in the world. So he was known not only from coast to coast, but around the world. But Thorpe's first love was football. And in 1912, he was in the midst of putting together one of the greatest seasons in college football history, rushing for nearly 1,900 yards, 27 touchdowns over the course of 12 games. And here's the crazy part. That total remarkably did not include 2 games that Carlisle played, but simply lost the stats for. So he probably had a lot more rushing yards and touchdowns that we aren't even aware of. We have the result, the score, but we don't have the stats. Then you have Army. The Army coach, not nearly as famous or as prominent in the history of college football as Pop Warner, but the coach was Ernest Graves, a career Army officer and West Point professor. This is back when football coaches were expected to be teachers as well, weirdly enough. Crazy idea. He only coached 2 seasons at West Point. He's more successful as a soldier than a coach. He later retired from the Army as a brigadier general. The captain of the Army squad was Leland DeVore. DeVore was a bruising blocker and locker room leader who earned All-American honors as an offensive lineman. He later served in World War I as an infantry officer before retiring from the Army as a lieutenant colonel. With respect to DeVore, DeVore might have been the captain, but their sort of emotional and inspirational leader of the Army squad that year was none other than Dwight Eisenhower, a linebacker / running back. Eisenhower today, of course, we know him as for his presidency. He served as president of the United States for 8 years, and also as the mastermind of the D-Day invasion. But in 1912, Eisenhower's focus was solely on college football, being basically the greatest football player the Army had ever produced. And he's widely considered to be a very competent running back, but also a vicious tackler. He had a talent for defense. By the way, Eisenhower and several of the Army players came into this game with the stated intention that they were going to not only win the game, but they were going to put a hit on Jim Thorpe that sent him to the hospital and hopefully ended his career. College football was a very brutal game back then. Not only that, reserve players for Army in this game was none other than Omar Bradley. Besides Eisenhower, the guy who had the most illustrious military career afterwards is Omar Bradley. He didn't see action that day, but he go on to forge a partnership with the Kansan Eisenhower that would eventually see him serving as Eisenhower's second in command in Europe during World War II. So this is like a Forrest Gumpian moment. You have all these big players in the realm of sports and politics and military history, all sort of converging together on one afternoon. Just as important as the cast of characters in this game is the context in which the game occurred. In 1912, the U.S. Military Academy was at the tail end of prosecuting a series of vicious conflicts across the Western states and territories against the indigenous inhabitants of those regions called the Indian Wars. And by the time the cadets and Indians, that was actually the team name, they were the Carlisle Indians, that was their team name, squared off with each other in 1912. Those conflicts are mostly over, but the memory of them was still visceral, especially for the Carlisle squad. Just 22 years before this game was played, one of the most infamous events of the Indian Wars occurred at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. It happened when a group of U.S. cavalry officers attempted to forcibly disarm an encampment of Lakota Sioux, some of whom were participants in a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance revival. No time to really go into detail about what that was. You can ask me about it in the Q&A if you wish. But the cavalry's actions resulted in kind of a confused skirmish between the warriors and the soldiers, pushing and shoving match in which somebody fired a shot, possibly on accident. A trooper was killed, and then the soldiers just opened up on the whole encampment. And more than 180 Sioux, mostly women and children, were massacred as a result. And for the Carlisle players on the field, the memory of what had happened at Wounded Knee and other encounters between soldiers and natives during the Indian Wars was still raw and visceral, as you might imagine. And hoping to tap into that sentiment, Coach Warner delivered a blistering pre-game speech in which he explicitly drew on the memory of Wounded Knee to inspire his players. He said, "I shouldn't have to prepare you for this game. Just go read your history books. Remember that it was the fathers and grandfathers of these Army players who fought your fathers and grandfathers in the Indian Wars. Remember that it was their fathers and grandfathers who killed your fathers and grandfathers at Wounded Knee. Remember this on every play." Football coaches then and now are not above exploiting the emotions of their players. Or you can tell. Okay. So, as the game got underway, the Army players focused on one objective above all. So, by the way, this is the ultimate David and Goliath matchups here. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine today, but back in the early 20th century, the Ivy Leagues like Harvard and Yale, and also the military academies, Army and Navy, were the cream of the crop. They were the powerhouses in college football. And then you've got Carlisle Indian Academy, a little Indian boarding school from the middle of nowhere, you know, far smaller in terms of student population, also far smaller in terms of resources, and just about every. It would be like if CCC suddenly, like the leadership at CCC suddenly got drunk and decided to start a football team, which we'll never do because we don't have money for it. And then all of a sudden we were competing against and beating the likes of Alabama and Ohio State and LSU. Like, it's not going to happen, but it was happening here. And so anyways, their objective is they're going to stop Thorpe because the Army players were far larger. They outweighed the Carlisle players by 20 pounds on average. But Carlisle had the best athlete on the field, the best player on the field, and everybody knew it. So you had to stop Thorpe. And as I said, a lot of the Army players came in with the explicit intention of knocking him out of the game. They got their chance early in the game during Carlisle's first drive after kickoff. As Thorpe attempted to run around the right end of the line of scrimmage for one of his signature gashing upfield games, Eisenhower and another Army defender had an angle on him, and they attempted to lay him out with what they called the 1-2, a high-low hit, where one defender goes up at the torso and another defender goes at the legs, which, as you all know, is basically designed to injure the opposing player, possibly take out his knee. And the hit was so jarring that it forced a fumble. Thorpe did fumble, and Army recovered, and it left Thorpe writhing on the ground, gasping for breath. He was hurt, but he was not injured. In a couple of minutes, he got up off the ground, and for the rest of the game, he would play with a ferocity seldom matched in his career. Early in the second half, Eisenhower and another Army player, Leland Haas, again had a chance to lay Thorpe out with a high-low tackle. This time, however, Thorpe was wise to what they intended, and so he basically juked them, did one of stutter step, and changed direction, causing them to crash into each other. Hobbs left the game concussed, and Eisenhower shredded his knee and would not play another down. And the result was, by the end of the game, Thorpe had produced another one of his signature gems, gashing Army for nearly 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Carlisle won the game by a dominating score of 27-6. And after the game, Army Captain Leland DeVore summed up Thorpe's impact for reporters, stating, frankly, that Indian is the greatest player I have ever stacked up against. He is superhuman. There's no stopping him. Right. Thorpe, and there's a newspaper announcing the result. Thorpe may have been superhuman against Army in 1912, but in the aftermath of the game, his life was going to take on a very different turn from some of the other key players involved in this contest. And the divergent fortunes of the cast of characters raises some fascinating questions, both about the game's possible impact on American history, but also about what it reveals about some of the enduring social ills and inequities of American society, both at that time and today. Dwight Eisenhower, by all accounts, the biggest impact of the game was on Dwight Eisenhower's life. Dwight Eisenhower, when he was at West Point, first half of his time at West Point, he was almost maniacally focused on football, on being the best football player he could be, the greatest football player that Army had ever fielded. But after the game, his career, he's never the same player. He re-injured his knee in a contest later against Tufts University, and he probably should never have been allowed on the field again. And then his career is basically over. And by all accounts, if you read biographies of Eisenhower, Eisenhower went into like a deep emotional, depressive spiral after the game. He felt, and he seriously considered dropping out of West Point altogether. But he did eventually recover, and he recovered in part because he found a new outlet for his competitive drive, coaching, being the assistant coach for the Cullum Hall football team, which was essentially West Point's JV football team, where he begins to hone a lot of the leadership and strategy skills that would eventually be put to use as Supreme Allied Commander in World War II in Europe. Pop Warner would go on to have one of the most legendary coaching careers in all of college football history. Never won the coveted national championship at Carlisle. His 1912 squad finished second in the rankings behind #1 Harvard. Again, it was a different time back then. But he would go on to coach at Pitt and Stanford and Temple universities, compiling a career record of 319 wins and national championships. Unfortunately for Jim Thorpe, his life after the 1912 Army game would be marked by at least as many tragedies and successes and setbacks as successes. A few months after the game, a Massachusetts newspaper ran a story that Thorpe had been paid to play semi-pro baseball during one of his off seasons, which under the hidebound rules governing college athletics at the time technically should have voided his amateur athletic status, making him ineligible to compete not only in college football, but also in the Olympics. And the result of that ensuing controversy is that Thorpe had his gold medals stripped from him by the Amateur Athletic Union, the antecedent of today's USOC, though they would be reinstated about 30 years after his death. For his part, Thorpe always acknowledged that he had played baseball for money. But he argued that he didn't know that there was any rule against it, which is plausible because he played under his own name. And in one of the supreme ironies of this story, many years later, out that Thorpe's nemesis on the field at West Point in 1912, Dwight Eisenhower, had also played semi-pro baseball for money while he was a student at West Point, which should have voided his eligibility. Eisenhower, however, apparently knew about the rule and was smart enough to play under an assumed name. We only know about it because this came out in a story published in the New York Times in 1945, at the end of World War II. But by 1945, Eisenhower was the hero of D-Day. He was Ike, as he was known affectionately by millions of his troops, so nobody cared. It did nothing to derail his future political career that would eventually carry him to the White House. Now, Thorpe would have some successes after college football. He would go on to play both professional baseball and football. He would briefly serve in 1920 as president of a loose association of pro football franchises that would eventually evolve into what we now know of as the NFL, the National Football League. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as part of its inaugural class in 1963. After his playing career was over, however, his life was marred by personal turmoil and constant battles with alcoholism. He was married 3 times, fathered 8 children, struggled to find steady employment. After sports, he worked variously as a bouncer, security guard, ditch digger. When he was hospitalized in 1950 with lip cancer, he was so broke that the hospital admitted him as a charity case. And in 1951, because he basically needed the money, he sold his life story to Warner Brothers, which turned it into the feature film Jim Thorpe, All-American, starring the very white Burt Lancaster in the titular role. And years later, Thorpe's daughter, Grace, would recall that her last memory of her father was dropping him off at a bus station shortly after the movie came out. And she said, "I can still see that Jim Thorpe All-American sign with Dad below carrying his starred leather suitcase." So that's the story. One of the reasons why I gravitate towards this story is because of the many tantalizing questions that it raises about American history, some of which I'll invite you to consider for yourselves here. One question is, what does the story have to tell us about the nature of structural racism? Now, that's kind of a trigger word for many people, structural racism. A lot of people hear it and they think of different things. Classic definition of structural racism is a system, and this is from the Aspen Institute, a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. So basically, it's when racism sort of gets baked into the prevailing systems that govern society, either cultural or business or political or economic. And it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. It can sometimes be unintentional, but when it works to perpetuate inequities, that's when they call it structural racism. So you think about the diverging fortunes of the two principal characters in the story, Thorpe and Eisenhower, who faced very different consequences for doing essentially the same thing, playing baseball for money, while technically athletic amateurs. Is this an example of structural racism? What do you all think? This is where I'm inviting the audience to give me feedback.
Sounds like it.
Okay.
Well, I think the problem is they should have been paid. Good question. So,
He didn't get caught, right?
I didn't get caught. Yeah. But, and that's an important point. I didn't get caught. Now, had he been caught, he would have faced the penalty. West Point and most of the college football teams of that era were very stringent about enforcing these rules. Even though he was the best player, West Point would have kicked him out like that. And West Point actually had a fairly long history, very frustrating to many of its fans, of kicking out top-notch players who got caught in various infractions of the honor code. But I didn't get caught because and here's a key point, I didn't get caught because Ike knew the rules. He knew to play under an assumed name. Thor didn't know the rule. By all accounts, if he'd known the rule, probably he would have taken measures to conceal what he had done, or else not do it. I'm not really sure what would have happened. And so why did Ike know the rule and Thorpe didn't? Possibly. Eisenhower, now, I should mention Eisenhower doesn't come from a silver spoon background. He comes from a tough Western town, Abilene, Kansas. He grows up, sort of a lower middle class background. He works his way up and earns everything he gets, but he does attend one of the most elite academic institutions in the country, where he rubs shoulders with the sons and grandsons of generals and senators and college presidents and so on. So maybe Eisenhower would have been in a position to know, just by virtue of his socialization, his contacts, about the rules governing amateur athletic status, whereas maybe somebody like Thorpe, pulling away in a small little unrecognized school, Indian boarding school in Pennsylvania, wouldn't have been in a position to know about that. Is it structural racism? Maybe, certainly bad luck, really bad luck. Depends on whether or not you consider intent to be necessary for structural racism, right? Which a lot of people do, and some people don't. If you don't consider intent to be part of it, then probably is. If you think intent has to be part of it, then maybe not, because probably these rules weren't created to ensnare people like Thorpe, but they ensnared people like Thorpe nonetheless. You had a question?
Well, if Thorpe would have been white and he just came off the Olympics winning these two events, he would have been immediately sucked into Harvard. I mean, they would have, the best schools on the land would have grabbed this guy and pulled him in, but he was an Indian.
Yeah, if he had been white, he probably would have been playing at Harvard or one of the other powerhouses because of his athletic.
Right.
When he played baseball for money, he was already boarding in Pennsylvania. And they let them go in the summer to find work, usually in the farms.
Yes.
So they played for room, board, and just a pittance expenses.
Yeah.
It's hardly fair to compare a middle class, white from a Midwestern town to an Indian in boarding school who has to either work somewhere, and he'd rather play baseball than, pitch bells to hay.
Yeah. And as he said, it was a lot more fun than whatever he was doing on the farm. So that's why he did it, ultimately. So yeah, the rules, almost certainly the people who designed these rules were not intending to snare up people like Thorpe. Let's snare up those people.
Days, you would have a Nike contract.
Yeah, you'd have a sweetheart NIL deal.
Yeah, he would have been super rich from the
Yeah,
Olympics.
because nowadays we can pay players in multitude in various ways. Although that's a fairly recent development, we're still kind of seeing how that's going to impact college sports. Yes.
Wouldn't it also be fair to say that, the coaches could have had part in it, for West Point, it's a bunch of military people, so briefs all the time on what to do, what not to do, especially when you release somebody for a long time, like whenever we go on leave or do a weekend, they brief you and say, hey, don't do this.
Oh, yes.
Don't do this.
So yeah, West Point being a military academy has a very rigorous enforcement system, making sure that, and also I don't know a lot about it, but there's kind of a weird social hierarchy that prevails based on class. By class, I mean which class you're in, freshman, junior, sophomore. And so the upperclassmen really give the underclassmen, the freshmen and sophomores heck. And they serve as monitors, to make sure that they're not stepping out of line. So yes, is the short answer to your question. There would have been more safeguards against that. Although it didn't stop Eisenhower from doing that. Yes. Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, are there any questions from Zoom land?
Not at this point. If you do have a question, those of you that have joined me in Zoom land, feel free to unmute and ask your question or give your comment.
Absolutely. So another question is, what does it say about the Indian boarding schools? What does the story say have to tell us about the Indian boarding schools? And in particular, the institution that the Carlisle team represented, Carlisle Indian Industrial School was its full name. Should schools like this have ever existed? Before you attempt to answer that question, let me give you a little background information about Carlisle specifically, and then also about the Indian boarding schools. Carlisle was founded by this guy in the top right, Richard Henry Pratt. And if you take graduate course in Native American history, or even an upper division undergraduate course, you probably encounter him. And he's considered to be one of the, oversimplifying, one of the bad guys in the long drama that is the relationship between indigenous peoples and the U.S. government. He was the founder of this institution, and Carlisle was really kind of the first successful long-term present institution within the Indian boarding school hemisphere. It's founded in 1879, and it proliferated. These types of institutions proliferated across the country from the late 19th century onward. A recent report that was issued just a few months ago by the Department of the Interior lists 408 of these institutions. That 408 of these institutions that in some way had federal funding or a relationship with the federal government in some way. In the case of Carlisle, it was built on the site of old army base. They had barracks that were donated to them. By the way, of those 408, 47 were in Arizona, more than any other state. And the stated goal of these institutions was to, quote unquote, civilize the Native Americans by educating them, by teaching them trades, not bad goals, but also, most importantly, by divesting them of any trace of their prior Indian heritage. And Pratt, unfortunately for Pratt, there's one quote that always gets attributed to him in any history textbook. He said that the goal of Carlisle, and by extension, most of the other Indian boarding schools, was to do what? Anybody know? Anybody know?
Civil.
Not to, he put it a little bit more brutally. Yeah. To kill. Anybody? Anybody? Kill the Indian and save the man. In other words, in order to save them, you have to kill the Indian inside of them. You have to extinguish their heritage, their culture. And today, these Indian schools are widely and rightly condemned for frequent abuse and neglect of their students. Carlisle, by the way, I mentioned the Department of Interior report. It's about a 100-page report, came out literally just a few months ago. It surveyed a variety of academic literature, tending to show that attendance at these institutions contributed to a variety of physical and psychological problems in former students, even years later, even decades later. Former students at these institutions often have to be treated for cancer, tuberculosis, anemia, diabetes, PTSD, depression, and on and on and on. It also contained unmarked grave sites at locations at least 20 of these schools. Carlisle again is kind of the prototype for the Indian boarding schools. And not surprisingly, it sees many of the same problems that you see throughout the whole Indian boarding school hemisphere. Overall, from 1879 to 1918, which exists, about 1 in 10 students who enrolled in the school died. Mostly of tuberculosis, which spread like wildfire among the students in its drafty barracks. So there's that to consider. Some have contended that the whole focus on civilizing the Native Americans amounted to what is sometimes called cultural genocide, or the attempt to eradicate a culture by means other than extermination. To that end, students at Carlisle were generally forced to adopt Anglo dress and Anglo haircuts. They were forbidden to speak their own language, to practice their own religious traditions, etc. So, should institutions like Carlisle have even existed? What do you think?
Yes.
For what reason?
Because what if they didn't? Now they're just left
No,
with no trades, couldn't read, write, couldn't live in society. I think it went badly, but I think the idea, not the cultural genocide part, but the educating, teaching trades was a good idea.
but what he hasn't said was they take them away from their parents, their grandparents, they take them away from their siblings. They have no
True. But
They had
still,
no back, they had
training-
no emotional
True.
connection to anything.
totally agree.
Was
But
there
still,
attendance force?
So that's a good question. Actually, the answer is sometimes. Sometimes yes and sometimes no. It kind of depended on the circumstances and the relationship between the government and the particular tribe. Sometimes the government would force them to send a certain number of their young people to these institutions. Carlisle, believe it or not, it appeared to have been all voluntary. Pratt and often gets portrayed as kind of the bad guy, and that he sort of founds this whole Indian boarding school movement that does so much harm. In many ways, he's actually, by the standards of his day, a racial liberal. In that he believed that there was a place in American society for the Native Americans. There were a lot of people in Pratt's day who did not believe that. Keep that in mind. I'll give you an example. Maybe you heard of a guy named L. Frank Baum? He's the author of a famous story known as the
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. In the 1890s, Baum was he was a newspaper editor for a small town newspaper in South Dakota, Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer, in which he explicitly advocated, and he was not alone in doing this, 1890s, for a policy of racial extermination, or what today we call genocide. He said, with his fall, basically being defeated in the Indian Wars and confined to the reservations, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished. What few are left are a pack of whining curs, who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by the law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements to be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. And around the turn of the last century, there were a lot of people, thankfully not the majority, but there were a lot of people who agreed with people like Paul. Right? So Pratt, and it seems weird to call him this, but by the standards of his day, he's kind of a racial liberal. And there's other aspects of his biography. You know, he's also an abolitionist and a former Union officer in the Civil War who went to war to fight to end slavery. And then he makes the great cause of his the second half of his life, the civilization of the natives. So he's a complex character. And a point that somebody else raised, Carlisle also produced hundreds of graduates. So the Indian boarding schools were obviously, in many ways, terrible places. That has to be stipulated, where all kinds of abuse and neglect and horrible things were done to the students. That has to be acknowledged. Unfortunately, for many Native Americans in the late 19th, early 20th century, they were also the only option. They were the only option if you wanted to get a vocational education or a college education of any kind. And Carlisle does produce a lot of graduates who become leaders in their communities and in the fight for Native American rights later in their lives. I mentioned Gus Welch, becomes a prominent college athletics coach. Carlos Montezuma, the team physician, graduate of Chicago Medical School. William Paul, first Native state legislature in Alaskan history. Would these students have been better off going to another institution? Of course they would. They have that option. And it's also worth considering what the emotional and psychological impact must have been of having such a high profile and successful college football team with nationally renowned athletes people who are literally world famous, like Jim Thorpe, coming from an all native school. What did that do for the morale of Native Americans across the country at a time when Native peoples had very little to cheer about? My point here is not to say that one answer to this question is right or wrong. I don't know, to be honest with you. What I would say is whatever your answer is, whether you say they should never have existed or they should have, you should probably be a little less certain about them. There's a lot of data points that point in either direction. What does this tell us about the role of sports in American society and history? It's commonplace today to celebrate sports as a vehicle for cultural and political change. When we think about the role of sports in society, we think about people like Jackie Robinson integrating baseball in the 1940s. But are sports a vehicle for positive social change? Women's sports. Okay, yeah, there you go. Right. Title IX has opened opportunities for women that frankly don't exist in most places, even most places in the developed, industrialized, developed Western world. It is. Arguably, athletes like Joseph Dion, Gus Welch, Jim Thorpe did much to improve the nation's towards Native Americans and their potential citizens capable of making meaningful contributions to their society. But then again, it's also true that the Carlisle players who defeated Army in 1912 citizens. Right, not until 1924, when they were finally granted citizenship by the US Congress. A fact that their much ballyhooed accomplishments on the football field did nothing to mitigate at the time. So, I'm done. What do you all have to say? Have any questions for me?
Amazing. Yeah, how does Warner's attitude compare to Pratt's?
How does who?
Top Warner?
So that's a good question. That's something that I was kind of interested to find out myself. I didn't actually run across much about, what his attitude towards Native Americans were beyond their potential as students and especially as student athletes. He seemed to be, from what I could tell, solely focused on that. He definitely believed that he had the potential to build a national championship team at Carlisle, and he wanted to prove that. And he got close a number of times. He never actually got there, unfortunately. But as far as what his view of the mission of institutions like Carlisle should have been, I don't see a coherent expression of his thoughts on that in any of the research that I've done. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist.
You said that he later coached at Temple.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Temple, Pitt, and Stanford.
Oh, yeah. Was Temple a school for blacks?
So,
Check that out.
Paul as an HBCU. Anybody want to look that up?
And I don't know the answer, but it's like I remember that. But
I must. If so, I am forgetting that fact. Any other questions? Questions, comments?
So, I'm still, teams that had Native American. Just the other day, we were watching Kansas City and I can tell you that when I'm sitting there with the rest of my Native friends, anytime we hear this,
The chant?
the chant
Yeah.
that these guys have in the background, it still pisses us off. It still does, because we're like, you guys, that's like the furthest thing that you can associate with natives from this country, yet you still perpetuate this sort of thing,
These stereotypes.
you know, where it's gotta mean something to make our football players play better than where we come. So, as a team and as fans, you know, and it's, but to us, it's still like, I at the same time, there's these guys that they're actually pretty, their team is called the Redskins,
Mhm.
and they're pretty,
Yeah.
and they're Native American.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
it's kind of funny. You know, it's like, you guys,
And I think
you
the
guys
coach was in the
understand?
news stating recently that they will never change it.
Yeah,
Like the school will never change it. They're gonna hold on to that. What's the team, town are they from?
I think it's Red Mountain Mesa.
So it's kind of ironic that the Red Mountain Redskins have survived as a team name longer than the Washington. Washington Commanders now. But yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, and so, so this question that you have, you know, it's like, what is the love of sports? And I would say, you know, I don't agree with that. That whole stereotypical type of behavior. Yet it still occurs, and yet it still happens. Let's me look at an impasse. What does a lot of sports say about that? I mean, is there somebody out there that's watching this sort of thing go on and sort of saying, you know, it's unfortunate, but how do we explain that?
Yeah. Sports can serve as a vehicle for social change, but they sure as heck don't change everything. Even within sports, as that example illustrates. So, yeah. And I'm not sure I have an answer to that question either. What is it that needs to happen in order to make sports a vehicle for positive social change? Is it just chance? Go ahead.
What was Pop Warner's contribution to the finances of Carlisle?
Big time. The football team was one of the major revenue generators for the school. And Warner, I don't have numbers in front of me, but Warner wanted everybody to know it. And for that reason, he also insisted on his players receiving special treatment. So they had their own dorms. They had their own dining hall, where presumably they got better food than the rest of their fellow students. They had recreational facilities, like they had a pool table in their dorm. Shocking, right? That student athletes would be accorded special privileges.
How much did he
I
make?
cannot believe that.
How much did he make?
I think, don't quote me on this, I think his salary was the then princely sum of $5,000 a year.
But the players got nothing,
Well, nothing, but
no money.
not money per se. Well, they might have gotten money too. You know, they weren't supposed to get paid, but they did get special privileges. Again, they had their own accommodations. They got to go on trips around the country. Warner often bought them suits of clothing to wear for away games.
Isn't this have perpetuated that all the universities get all this money And the students get an education quote.
Yeah, so that raises another question, and that's like, what are the ethics of paying student athletes? And if so, how should they be paid? And if so, which of them should be paid and how much? The reality is, and I know way more about this than I should, in part because a long time ago, when I was a doctoral student at LSU, I was the TA for the then university system president, John,
What's it?
teaching assistant,
Oh, okay.
for a course called Intercollegiate Sports in America, which was a hit of college sports. And one of the facts that I came away with from that experience, reading all those student papers and attending all the lectures, is that most college sports actually don't make money. Most athletic departments in the country are a net deficit, financial deficit to their institutions. Most athletic departments cost their institutions money. And most sports, the vast majority of sports teams cost their students money, sometimes to the financial black hole levels. They're giant financial black holes sucking in resources that the institutions can seldom afford. The only sport that consistently makes money in even the upper echelons, D1 of college sports, is football. Football, sometimes baseball, if you've got a really good, and also on very rare occasions, men's and women's basketball. Everything else loses money. Everything else loses money, and most athletic departments cost their institutions money. So the football team at Carlisle brought in a lot of money, but other sports, I frankly don't. I know that they had football. I know they had track and field. I don't know what other sports they had. But most other sports probably didn't. So the argument for paying players, sense, because supposedly they're generating all this revenue for the institution, unless you're talking about football players at big time universities, doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Our wives will kill us. We have to leave at 7. Sorry, thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
Any other questions? Any questions from the Zoom folks? I want to make sure the Zoom folks have a chance to chime in. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I think just sports itself is really bonding for communities, for people, for families, and it brings people together. Aside, when you have groups of people and they're just involved in saying, come on, let's go, go team, go, and their team wins and they're so excited. It's a little thing, but it's a big thing. And it builds a lot of good feeling and goodwill, which I think is important.
It's what we sometimes call a social lubricant. It's an opportunity for people to gather together, to make connections, including connections. I really think high school sports especially play this function. To make connections with other people in their communities that can benefit the community in a variety of ways, serving, as a vehicle for volunteerism, for serving in community organizations.
And
So absolutely agree with that.
to meet people from other parts of the world, from other parts of the country. They travel sometimes. All of this is enriching and broadening to each individual and their families and their groups. And it just goes from little to bigger to bigger to bigger to bigger.
I would tend to agree with you. So, yeah. I think like anything, sports, and it can serve as a vehicle for community building. It can also become divisive.
Yeah, that's too bad.
An opportunity for people to build, us versus them dichotomies.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true too.